in terms of some of the threads that run between the two papers that I think are of interest to us, one is the fact that both of you problematize the category social movement and then go on to use the category social movement. And I sympathize greatly with that problem. And I just want to flag that and then talk a little bit about what each of you do with that. The second thing is that I think both of you are preoccupied with the question of activist scholarship, or the relationship between intellectuals and movements, scholarship and activism, and relatedly, the role of the university in its relationship to movements or to activism or to the radical imagination. So just starting with those kind of preliminary remarks. So Alex, first of all, to your paper on the radical imagination. So my first question, I guess, has to do with this category, the radical imagination, and both what it is and what it can do for us. And I think on one hand, it can provide us with, I don't know, a placeholder or another way of talking about movement. And like Sonia yesterday in your presentation last night, you know, really, I think you probably fair to say that you have decided, you've moved decisively away from using the category movement in favor of discursive field of action. I think that's what you were proposing, right? And I wonder, Alex, whether your use of the term radical imagination is something like that, something like trying to think about movement in another way. But I wonder about what kind of content, I guess, is attributed to that. Because I think there is a presumption that it has certain kind of content. And so here's what I discern from your paper, and I don't know if this is right, but I'll try this out. It seems to be anchored very much in the experience of Zapatismo. And so therefore the sense that the radical imagination is, I mean, you talk about it as something that needs to be convoked or summoned, something that's done together, something that's sparked in dialogic encounter, something that's ephemeral. In terms of the Zapatistas, something that's an intuition, that's grounded in story and practice, that is grounded in the lived experience of Zapatista communities, that is defined in dialogue with other struggles, that is radically democratic, that is anti-capitalist, that says no to state power, that wants to create a world capable of holding many worlds together, and positions itself against the imposition of any single way of thinking. So I just one question, I guess, is that does that describe what you mean by the radical imagination? Because I think that there is a tension between a certain kind of content, political content, and a certain kind of openness. And how do we adjudicate that, I guess? And it's related to the earlier question about, to Mashtaba, about revolutionary and counter-revolutionary, or what is the content of social justice? I mean, at the end of the day, even though we're working with these movements that are open-ended and undefined or defining themselves as they go along, we are also, many of us, I think, quite explicit about our ethico-political agendas and projects. And so I would invite you just to grapple with that a bit, or say some more about how you think about that. So that's one thing. The second thing is about your problematizing the notion of social movement, but then going on to employ it. And then when you do employ it, it's in the context, I think, of your critique of assemblage thinking or your concerns about it. And that I see two big critiques that you're making. One is that you're nervous that it valorizes failure. So in its kind of valorizing constant emergence or constant assembling and disassembling and reassembling and ephemerality, that it valorizes failure on the one hand. And secondly, because of its post-structuralist roots, it's too overly concerned with subjectivity and affect, and you're nervous that it leaves aside concerns about material redistribution. And then you seem then to reintroduce the category social movement as something that seems to be very agentic, like something that is actually, as you say, you're looking for ways to think about movement and support movements that are powerful, robust, resilient, social movements to win, that can win, and social movements that are durable. And so I guess, again, there's a tension for me there between a notion of movement as an agent that has a certain look, has a certain kind of agenda, has a certain kind of political content attached to it, and at the same time, a category that's problematic. And I'm saying this because I share this problem. So I would just like to hear you say more about that. Just an additional kind of footnote is that I think in terms of thinking about the Zapatistas, the Zapatistas have been this incredibly inspirational and fertile site, to think about a lot of these questions. And in reading again about the Zapatistas, I just sounded so much like Mark's paper about the Falahin, about this combination or this combination between a kind of millennial resistance, millennial existence, people grounded in land and corn and memory and so on, living as if they're sovereign, practicing autonomy, and at the same time recombining with kind of revolutionary rhetorics, reaching for globality through modern media, and so on. So I just thought, again, it just reminded me of the very different kinds of movements that we're trying to think together with. And then lastly, for Alex, in terms of your discussion of Occupy Nova Scotia, this was also very interesting insofar as, again, it raises this tension between assembly movements and they're autonomist. And I just want to clarify our earlier exchange. She was saying autonomous movements, and I was saying autonomist politics, as a certain kind of strand of autonomist Marxism and autonomist anarchism. That I think the politics of the Occupy in Nova Scotia and the Occupies in North America had this strong autonomist character to them. But then you testify how it can slide into this kind of nationalism, right? This kind of patriarchal, military patriarchal, patriotic nationalism. And how easily the kind of good liberal citizen, Occupy slid into that good liberal citizen. And your response to that is that you're saying that movements need to be more clear, and they need to be beyond merely democratic. So again, there's that tension between some kind of content that we think is the content of the revolutionary or the content of social justice or the content of the radical imaginary, and this open-ended emergence. So those are just some thoughts for you. Okay, so Jackie, I think some of the same things in the sense of the question about movement, that on one hand, you, as we all are grappling with the relevance of this category, and on the other hand, being very concerned about how to build power and build agency and build alliances, and the question of their effectiveness and their learning how to do things better. So that tension between, tension between the open-endedness of these practices and the need to think politically and about power, right? And you're talking about the importance of the scholar activist positionality, or the observant participation, and the kind of critical positionality of that. Okay, so here's some questions. One is a question about, which others have already named, and that is and this is in Alex's paper too, a narrative that seems to place the post-2010 assemblages, number one, as responses to the 2008 financial crisis, which I think you mentioned already is kind of why we do that. And secondly, as in the genealogy of the anti or global justice movement. And I just want to think with you about what's at stake in that claim. That I think it reflects a certain investment in seeing these movements and their economic justice claims as part of a single thing. And I wonder what we obscure with that. So it's a question. Second thing is the points you make about the movement for human rights cities. And of course, bringing human rights to bear in the US is itself a kind of revolutionary act, since human rights have been from the West to the rest, you know. And also, as you say, being embraced by the groups most affected by violations, and that they clearly have investments in human rights discourses, and they're in the process of remaking human rights discourses. And I guess I want to ask here, and you're anticipating the question in your paper, and that is that do rights discourses colonize movements, or do movements colonize rights? Because I think that's a live question for many movements. On one hand, it's such a hegemonic discourse of justice globally, but on the other hand, it presupposes so much of the modern apparatus of power, right? And the modern state, modern legalities, political modernization more broadly. And so I know you're aware of that, but it's just a question about that. And again, it's a question about there is an international human rights movement, and movements are using this, and movements are making these rights, they are localizing them, and they're making them vernacular, you know, in Sally Mary's language. But I guess to hear you talk a little bit more about the contradictions or the limitations of that. And then your discourse about the right to the city and the invoking of insurgent citizenship seemed to me also to resonate, and it would be an interesting kind of conversation with the Gezi papers, because to what extent, I wonder, would you say that the Gezi movement was also about a movement about the right to the city, or was that a relevant discourse at all? And how, or all of these movements of the squares, to what extent they resonate with that kind of claim about the rights to the city, and that the right to the city, as you talk about it, is also a struggle against dispossession. Like it's against, it recognizes that the polarized nature of cities as capitalist spaces, and these claims by displaced populations, who are often very racialized populations, and who are subject to apartheid, that the struggles for rights to the city are struggles against dispossession. So I thought that was could possibly be a very fruitful exchange. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks again to the organizers for putting this together. It was really such a rich provocation paper that you provided us with, and I don't think when I submitted my original abstract that before I'd read that piece, I was thinking about doing something different, and really, after reading the provocation paper, it got me thinking in very different directions, and I really appreciated that. So I'll try to keep this on point. Just to start with the concept of the radical imagination, actually, I think you're absolutely right, Janet, when you said it is like a placeholder. And Max Haven and I, in the Radical Imagination Project, have been using it explicitly in that way. In our writing around it, we talk about it that way. In the same way that theorists who are also sort of fellow travelers on this road, like Robin Kelly, for example, in his excellent book, The Black Radical Imagination, talks about it in the same way. That it's this kind of like traveling process of people, or Eric Selbin in his excellent work on story and social movements. This is a way of us narrating. When we come together, we tell stories about who we are, where we've come from, and where we are going. And it's really, the radical imagination is not a thing we have, it's something we do together. So in any particular context, in any specific movement, amongst any given collective, it has specific content, of course. But in that case, I would stop talking probably about the imagination and talk about imaginaries, as you slipped into too, and I think that's totally correct. So Zapatismo, for example, in its transnational articulation, is a radical political imaginary, for sure. It's an example of people doing the radical imagination, of figuring out, sort of, to use an overly romantic metaphor, where the North Star of our struggle is, right? And orienting ourselves in that way. So for me, it's, this project started after the global capitalist, cataclysm of 2008. In light of those questions that so many of us were asking, where are the movements? Where's the pushback? This is the crisis. Shouldn't, if orthodox Marxists are right about anything, surely this is going to reveal something. And instead, we found that people were largely lost, at least in the Anglophone North Atlantic anyway, in those first few years. And so we wanted to do something. We wanted to put the resources in this weird and unjust autonomy of the university to work. With people who are organizing on the ground in different ways, by doing what we thought, by providing resources and, more importantly, time in a process that we thought was lacking. And that's what the radical imagination, I think, speaks to, this need to distinguish between strategies and tactics, to distinguish between our political horizons and our specific goals. And in so much of the celebration, I think, of so many contemporary radical movements, and I would even say I heard it this morning a little bit in the use of the term revolution. I'm not really sure, to go back to Jackie's point, that we would know what a revolution looked like if we saw it, and I'm uncomfortable with the slippage that we've entered into. I mean, in what sense is Egypt a revolutionary situation? If revolution means a fairly rapid, total transformation of a society's political, social, and economic structure, I don't think it's been revolutionary. It's certainly a regime change, but those are different things. So I would say we see so much of that within radical movements today, certainly in the area that I work, in Halifax, in Nova Scotia more broadly, in the Anglophone North Atlantic even more broadly than that. There is a celebration of spectacle and effect, and an absence sometimes of really, and this is not a Leninist argument, but an absence of tactical and strategic thinking oriented to radical horizons of where we want to go. And I would just to finish my comments on this question, I would say the Zapatistas are an excellent example of this. In so many of their declarations, particularly in the 6 major declarations that mark the stages of their movement, they begin by narrating that, who we are, where we've come from, how we understand the world right now, where we want to go. And in a way, that's sort of like a textual embodiment of the radical imagination in one iteration. And we humbly thought, Max and I, that more activists and organizers in the global north could do some of that stuff too, and really confront the contradictions that you pointed to so well last night. And today again, in terms of settler coloniality, for example, within this space, but not only patriarchy, heteronormativity, so many others, ableism, ageism, so many things that in terms of the contradictions between our rhetoric, our social justice rhetoric, and the way our movements are built and work, and the way that they all too often reproduce dynamics of oppression within their own structures, that we need to create time and space and a process to consider that and to sort of rethink ourselves and our movements in a way that's not just strategic and also in a way that doesn't reproduce those blind spots. And there are lots of other folks who have been doing that. Again, the work of Robin Kelley, I think, is a wonderful example, but theorists like Mikhail Bakhtin, to Ernest Bloch, to Cornelius Castoriadis, so many people working in that tradition as well. In terms of my use of social movement, I would only come back to this. It's funny, in my paper, I think I intended to use the language of assemblage more until I confronted how uncomfortable it made me. I use social movement because I am, as I age, becoming more of a political pragmatist, I think. I like the category. I don't see a reason to fundamentally replace it. I have to be honest with that. And the folks that I work with, the activists and organizers, would not choose to talk about themselves as an assemblage, would roll their eyes and would see it as a colonization of movement spaces by academics once again. And that's not to be unkind to the concept, I think. But I think there's utility in social movement. I think movement can be, if we think about it in an expansive way. So I don't really have any fundamental, I have a problem with it when it reifies the things that we do, but I don't have a problem with its clarity because I think people get it. So I like it for that reason. The third thing about the example of, and I would only say, just to expand on that, I see the relationship between the academy and movements as a fundamentally troubled one, and one that the neoliberal university cannot escape. There is no resolution. There is no way, no matter how many institutes we build or how many well-intentioned interventions we create, to render the university as it's currently constituted a socially just space. I think the best we can hope for is what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney talk about in their book, The Undercommons, for those of us who work within it, is a fugitive relationship to the university where we steal resources from it and give it to people who are doing real things in the world. And that is, not to be too sort of like melodramatic about it, but I think it's just worth thinking about in terms of what we do. Certainly what we thought about in the Radical Imagination Project was that we simply we weren't looking at generating good data. We were looking at creating interventions that activists and organizers were telling us they needed, sometimes even when they didn't know they needed it, in order to open up space and time for movements and their participants to radically confront what was keeping them from having an effect in the world. And then to provide them with resources quite tangibly, like money and other supports that would allow them to keep doing that, to support people who capitalism and patriarchal white supremacy wants to grind down and jail and kill and oppress. And whatever humble intervention, I want to emphasize that, like it's super humble intervention, I think we can make, or activists inside the academy can make, we should be making. So I don't see any role for the university to play, really, structurally in relation to movements. I see a role for dedicated people within those spaces to work and to steal from, to subvert the mission of the university in that way, as a curator of knowledge, as a guardian of social mores, as a all too willing servant of dominant interests and traditions of thinking, as you pointed out, right, settler coloniality. And the last point I'll make is just around what Occupy revealed. I think you're absolutely correct. I love democratic practice. I think democracy is super important, but I am troubled by the resonance of a fairly empty concept amongst people at a transnational level. I think it points to something they feel they're lacking in their daily lives. I think that's absolutely correct. I don't feel like I live in a democratic space in Halifax or in this settler colonial place we call Canada. But I also don't think democracy is enough. I don't think the idea of people's power is a correction or is a muscular enough response to patriarchal, white supremacist, colonial capitalism. And I think we need to do more than ask for as one of my research participants once said, a seat at the table surrounded by executioners, you know? So for me, democracy is not enough. And I think it's revealed in the example of Occupy Nova Scotia. There was also, the one thing I would just add to that is that I'm unwilling to throw the autonomist baby out with the bathwater. I think one of the great failures of Occupy Nova Scotia, and it may be true of Occupies elsewhere, was the relatively shallow, and this is something that we try to do through the project, what we're focusing on right now, is the fact that movements, for so many reasons, and many of you would know them, so I won't rehash the issues, don't do a great job of curating or transmitting knowledge intergenerationally for activists, right? So what one generation learns, another won't necessarily learn, won't even have that information available to them. How can they, and I'm not trying to sort of celebrate or valorize elders, movement elders unnecessarily, because knowledge comes from all kinds of different directions. But what went on in that camp was great. But on the other hand, it was also like a really shallow practicing of what people understood anarchism to be, of what they understood autonomist-oriented practice to be. And it was really spectacularly revealed in this debacle, I think, that they entered into once they started to dialogue with the state, with the microstate in Halifax over Remembrance Day, and how they couldn't critique militarist nationalism because we're in Halifax, and Halifax is a military city, and many Nova Scotians have family in the military. And it rendered what was a space that had great promise really compromised. And the eviction was that was sort of the secondary moment of the actual defeat of Occupy Nova Scotia. So I think you're absolutely right, but I think it has something to do, again, with the fact that we don't have the time, the process, or the resources all too often as activists, academics, or as activists to confront the contradictions and to clarify our visions of what we're struggling for and how we're going to get there in the context of where I work. And that's what I'm interested in terms of my limited and humble contribution as a scholar activist, interested in putting the resources and autonomy of the university to work in those spaces.
I agree with a lot of Alex's response on the thoughts on defining social movements and some of the challenges we have. And I think just one way to think about this challenge is that we're trying to change the system while we're working within it. And the language is part of that system, and people's understanding is part of that, but we also need language to communicate. So I think that's why I slipped into using movement language again. But I do like the idea of movements as discursive fields of action, and I think that's certainly an important part of what's happening in movements, and really creating spaces for knowledge building and unthinking the system, unthinking the structures that reproduce the relationships that we're trying to change. So I like the discursive, the attention to discourse there, but I think there's other other practices that are part of creating spaces for that discourse to happen, and so movements encompasses a lot more than that. On why I associate the movements of what Chris Chase Dunn calls the revolution of 20XX with broader global justice movements, and what is obscured by that, I think actually more is obscured by taking them out of that world historical context, because I think we really need to understand all of these struggles as reactions or responses to similar kinds of conditions that are being created globally through this global system of capitalism that isn't going to be changed in any one country or by the overthrow of a single country leader. So we have to think of them in those world historic terms, and when we look at their practices and discourses, we also find continuities, and that's what's some continuities, but as Alex pointed out, we don't have enough of the accumulation of knowledge from the previous struggles. So I did a paper in the journal that Leslie edits, which was taking out some of my frustrations with the Occupy struggles and all the lessons that weren't learned from transnational feminism and the World Social Forums, and the frustrations I had with trying to translate some of that in this context where there were intergenerational tensions and gendered issues that created difficulties for movement learning, or Alex calls it the crisis of movement reproduction, which I think is an important problem that we should be thinking about, because there are some important lessons from assemblages, but how are they being accumulated, translated, shared, and shared across generations and across cultures? I think that's perhaps one of the projects that intellectuals can play in these struggles. Then rights discourse, and I think I talked a bit about why I came to use this organizing frame, because it wasn't one that I was naturally drawn to. It was just observing what was happening, and then seeing the real potential. Because yes, clearly rights discourses have colonized movements, but I was seeing that it was people who were really, on the radical side of movements, who were embracing the language and seeing the potential to build broad alliances and to really get a focused critique of capitalism. That's really, it gets to what Emmanuel Wallerstein sees as this contradiction between the practices of global capitalism and the legitimating ideology, which is based in human rights. And so by focusing on human rights, you can really zero in on the hypocritical nature of capitalism and get a very systemic critique. And just for instance, in Pittsburgh, just by creating a space where we can get people to talk about how would we make our city look more like a human rights city, it doesn't take very long for even the most moderate or mainstream thinkers to see that it's this focus on money and markets and international investors that's our biggest obstacle. So it's actually a very counter-hegemonic language, but it's inviting to people who otherwise you wouldn't be able to engage. So it's been interesting to engage people in those conversations and see what they do with it. But I've certainly been inspired really by seeing that who is leading this. It's coming from the Global South. It's coming from the people who are most impacted by human rights violations, who are embracing it. So who am I to say it's not radical enough? But it's interesting that it's a lot of the main middle class white folks that I've got to convince, and they see me as a white academic. What do I know about radical politics? So there's all kinds of struggles. So if I may, I might just offer some thoughts on what I think we could see from looking at various kinds of assemblages, what seems to signal effective kinds of assemblages or transformative movements. And I think this focus on assemblages draws our attention to the need for spaces of encounter, so creating spaces. All of these assemblages are about making space that brings in diverse folks to really engage with one another and engage in conflict and productive forms of conflict. The most transformative instances are sustained and offer space for reflexivity. So people stay engaged even if there is conflict. They come back. They talk with one another, and they learn from this engagement and engage in that work of unthinking. I think also effective assemblages or movements, I'm not sure the language to use, but they generate projects that invite greater inclusivity and participation from a broader public, so thereby extending the learning, perhaps contributing to this kind of movement reproduction and expansion that's essential to the kind of transformation we're trying to build. So the idea of anti-systemic socialization, I think, is helpful to thinking about what assemblages in this particular historical moment might be about at a time when the system is clearly in crisis and needs to people need to think about what alternatives there could be. So this radical imagination, I think, is important there. Insurgent citizenship, I think, is another interesting idea that I encountered in looking at the city work. And this, if capitalism is constantly pushing more people or dispossessing more and more people and more of the earth, these movements are reflecting new kinds of, or new real means of inclusion and a new language for that. So I think they're a really interesting set of or collection of movements to think about as a response to what Saskia Sassen calls expulsion, that is really innate to the system of global capitalism. What's been interesting in working with activists is that the definitions of citizenship are they're really challenging individualism, and so calling for communal orientation. So even the right to the city, it's really not about my neighborhood, it's about my larger community and the quality of life there, the environmental focus. And I've even been challenged by some of the folks I'm working with on the Housing Summit on the whole notion of right to the city. So the city is a problematic space, a problematic mode of social organization, ecologically and socially. And so people are even challenging that idea. And then the rural, we're engaging with rural communities, and they say, well, we want to be part of this too. So really, by creating this space, we're starting conversations about how do we organize human societies in different ways. So maybe I'll just close with a few thoughts on who will change the world and how do we deal with this. It's going to be an assemblage, but we have to be in it. And the more I think about how our work is organized, and the more I try to do this work, if you let me show you the websites that I've built, I'll show you how to build your own, because we have to be able to do that. But we've been organized out of the movements by an increasingly corporatized university system, and we need to start organizing ourselves to fight that, because the movements need the spaces that we control. They need the resources that we have access to, and universities are some of the only spaces where that can counter the tendency in capitalism to segregate and divide people according to categories. And I find over and over again that the kinds of things I end up organizing are some of the only spaces where certain kinds of people would ever meet each other or have a chance to even think about stuff that we engage them with. And we can do that because we're in a university and we have access to students with diverse backgrounds and an audience that even influential audiences that otherwise wouldn't engage with these radical ideas that we're talking about. So we have some privilege that we have to use better. And if we don't, we're actually reproducing the system just by teaching our courses and trying to get good course evaluations, by not making students, not making them uncomfortable. All right, so how can we better support social movements? Appropriating resources and using the spaces that we have, organizing ourselves so that we can do that better and create spaces for encounter and assembly. And I think also one thing I've learned that I think is important for contributing to the work of assemblages is that we really need to find ways in our academic lives to really be participants in movements so that we can learn over time and build relationships that are really fully collaborative. I've learned so much from the work I've done with movement folks, and by being engaged for 10 years, that you can't really understand all the complexities of what we're talking about without that kind of engagement. So we need to find ways in our institutions to support that kind of work, because that's essential for understanding what we're trying to be talking about today.